Glad you could join us today on Earthfile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. Many scientists expect the biggest annual fall in carbon emissions in generations this year, as measures to contain coronavirus have grounded planes, docked ships, and kept commuters at home. Unfortunately, greenhouse gas concentrations climbed to a new record in 2019 and rose again this year, despite an expected drop in emissions due to COVID-19 lockdowns. So, this year is on track to be the second hottest on record, behind 2016. 5 data sets currently place 2020, a year characterized by heat waves, droughts, wildfires, and raging hurricanes, as the second warmest since records began in 1850. Let's now see what these all mean. I will start with a story in Burkina Faso. Just stay with us.
Climate change, a global pandemic, and escalating conflict is hammering the majority of countries affected by the rise in temperature and disrupting programs to alleviate the effect of desertification and erratic rainfall. An international committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent report published in July 2020 says that out of 20 countries most vulnerable to climate change, 60% are living in conflict zones. Unless urgent action is taken to mitigate the effect of global warming, the ICRC says 200 million people will need international humanitarian aid by 2050, doubling the 2018 figure. The report focused on Mali, the Central African Republic, and Iraq. Nigeria, too, which borders with Mali, Burkina Faso, and Nigeria, where attacks are spiraling, illustrates the stress on herders who have lost land and access to water and forced thousands away from their homes in search of better grazing conditions and fleeing violence. Habibu Swari had to pause for breath as she ran barefoot from the gunmen approaching her village. She had no time for belongings, but for one vital load, unborn twins due any day. Soon after arriving at a nearby town in northern Burkina Faso, feet cut and swollen, Swari gave birth. Then a battle with hunger began. Today she is visiting a health center supported by the United Nations Children's Fund in Kaya, where she lives with her uncle. The population of Kaya has doubled in the last year and a half because of influx of villagers fleeing violence in the Sahel region. The
day they arrived, it was in the neighboring village that they started. We got the warning that they were on their way to us. We saw them coming with 3 motorbikes and 2 people on each motorbike. They went into the neighbor's house. They had already fled, and they stole everything, all the cattle. We wanted to get out as well, and I was the first to leave because I was pregnant.
Attacks by Islamist groups with links to Islamic State have killed thousands this year in the Sahel, an arid belt to the south of the Sahara Desert. The escalating bloodshed has worsened food shortages that threatened millions in a region already hit by climate change, poverty, and the COVID-19 pandemic. 16 months after fleeing, Swari is still displaced and has enough food for one small meal a day. Her twin sons, Sawadago and Nasen, weigh 7 kilograms each, the equivalent of a healthy 4-month-old. Their bony legs are covered in sores, their scalps bare in patches. They scream for the milk their mother cannot provide. As she breastfeeds her twin sons in Kaya Clinic, Swari said she is worried about their health and says they are not doing well.
Everything is different now from what it was in the village, even here in Pisala. Just to have the bare minimum to survive is very hard. We don't eat enough, and we have nothing to live from like we used to in the village.
The walls of the clinic are painted with drawings showing mothers what to feed their children. over 7 million face acute hunger in a vast area comprising landlocked Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, as armed groups cut off access to supplies and farmland. Burkina Faso is deteriorating fastest. Over 500,000 children under 5 are acutely malnourished. World Food Programme said in October that over 10,000 people were one step short of famine. Dozens of health facilities have closed and about 200 others are operating at a minimum, according to government figures. Midwife Aminata Zabar works at the Kaya Clinic. She says many mothers are suffering mental and emotional scars from the conflict and the loss of their way of life.
Some of the women here have been psychologically affected by the violence and attacks. So how can a woman who is psychologically affected get her child out of the cycle of malnutrition? We have this kind of situation, which is not easy at all to deal with. The other day, I was asking this woman why she was always with her child. She said it's because her father-in-law eats the child's rations.
Malnutrition is overwhelming the clinic in Kaya, where Sore took her twins. Before the crisis, it had about 30 child patients. Now it has 500. Aminata says patients come in every day with severe cases of malnutrition. Mothers come regularly for a sachet of baby food, though sometimes that does not help. This summer's rainy season in Burkina Faso was one of the heaviest in years, bringing life to the hilly northern savanna, where neem, eucalyptus and acacia trees tower over a sea of waist-high golden grass. Farmers say the conditions are perfect for crops and cattle, if only they could reach them. Sayuba Zebra should be harvesting 10 hectares of millet and sorghum and tending dozens of cattle near his hometown in Sam province. Instead, he is in a camp for displaced people in the Centre-North region after fleeing an attack this year. Camp residents collect wood and dry hibiscus pods on the roofs of their makeshift tents, anything to make a small amount of money. Sayuba planted millet and peanuts, but it is not enough to feed his family. He says his heart is broken, knowing he cannot work the field to provide for himself and his family.
We had and lost around 15 hectares of arable land for cattle. We lost around 60 herds of ox, without forgetting all our personal belongings. Those represent massive losses. We can't put a number to it. It just represents huge losses.
The World Food Programme is unable to access some areas twice this year. Food deliveries were hijacked, said the World Food Programme's country's director in Burkina Faso. The conflict is also affecting thousands of children who cannot go to school. A UNHCR camp in Jori, west of Kaya, and close to the borders with Niger and Mali, has had to expand the tented camp this year to house 485 more people. Teachers like Amidou Mega teach overflowing classrooms with few books. Regularly, they practice a safety drill in case of attacks.
When we blow the whistle 3 times, the children know there is danger. And when there is danger, they have to throw themselves on the ground. And that is because we are in a classroom that children have to hide under tables to protect their heads. We do not shout, we do not speak, we do not cry, and also we don't try to run away.
Cases like this caused the United Nations chief to call for a breakthrough to help poorer countries adapt to a hotter world where what he called apocalyptic fires and floods are becoming the new normal.
And I welcome
In a speech titled The State of the Planet, United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said there was a moral and economic case for giving more support to developing countries to deal with climate change impact rather than focusing investment mostly on cutting emissions.
We face three imperatives in addressing the climate crisis. First, we need to achieve global carbon neutrality within the next 3 decades. Second, we have to align global finance between the Paris Agreement, the world's blueprint for climate action. And third, we must deliver a breakthrough on adaptation to protect the world, and especially the most vulnerable people and countries, from climate impacts. I ask all countries to reach a compromise on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement as they prepare for COP26 to get us the clear, fair and environmentally sound rules carbon markets need to fully function. And I welcome the work of the task force launched in September, with members representing 20 sectors and 6 continents, to develop a blueprint for large-scale private carbon offset markets. Third, we need a breakthrough on adaptation and resilience. We are in a race against time to adapt to a rapidly changing climate. And adaptation must not be the forgotten component of climate action. Until now, adaptation represents only 20% of climate finance, reaching $30 billion on average in 2017 and 2018. This hinders our essential work for disaster risk reduction. And it also isn't smart. The Global Commission on Adaptation found that every dollar invested in adaptation can yield almost $4 in benefits. We have both a moral imperative and a clear economic case for supporting developing countries to adapt and build resilience to current and future climate impacts. Before COP26, all donors and the multilateral and national development banks should commit to increase the share of adaptation and resilience finance to at least 50% of their climate finance support. Early warning systems, climate-resilient infrastructure, improved dryland agriculture, mangrove protection and other steps can give the world a double dividend, avoiding future losses and generating economic gains and other benefits. We need to move to large-scale, preventive and systematic adaptation support. And this is especially urgent for small island developing states which face an existential threat. The race to resilience is as important as the race to net zero.
Less than 2% of climate finance goes to small-scale farmers in developing countries, according to a new report by the United Nations International Fund for Agricultural Development and Climate Policy Initiative. The report found that just 1.7% of funds available to help tackle and adapt to climate change went to small-scale farmers in developing countries, despite them being disproportionately vulnerable to climate change. Higher temperatures, increased droughts and flooding continue to destroy crops and livelihood, making it difficult for farmers to feed their communities and earn a living. Small-scale farmers produce 50% of the world's food calories. If they cannot keep producing food, global hunger will inevitably rise.
Honestly, this changing weather really scares me. The sun is scorching and clouds pass by quickly.
The Examining the Climate Finance Gap for Small-Scale Agriculture report found that climate change financing surpassed $500 billion for the first time in 2017 and 2018, but only $10 billion was earmarked for small-scale farmers. IFAD is calling for more climate investment to be directed at this vulnerable group, which will not just benefit the farmers, but the global community as a whole.
Climate finance directed at small-scale farmers results in the continued production of nutritious, affordable food for wider communities. This means that these are investments that help eradicate hunger, which are investments in global peace, well-being and stability.
IFAD's Adaptation for Smallholder Agriculture program is the largest global climate adaptation program for smallholder farmers, which has already channeled more than $300 million to more than 5 million farmers in 41 countries. The World Meteorological Organization described the projected 2020 drop in temperature as a tiny blip and said the resulting impact on the carbon dioxide concentrations that contributes to global warming will be no bigger than normal annual fluctuations.
The impact of COVID on emissions is between 4 to 7%. So despite the fact that it looked like that the world stands still, we get only the decrease of 4 to 7% in emissions which we produce. So our whole economy and our consumption partners actually wire us to the extremely high emissions, even if we all sit on lockdown and limit our mobility, because lockdown is only limit on the mobility and not on our consumption.
The annual report released by the Geneva-based UN agency measures the atmospheric concentration of the gases, carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide, that are warming our planet and triggering extreme weather events. Levels of carbon dioxide, a product of burning fossil fuels that is the biggest contributor to global warming, touched a new record of 410.5 parts per million in 2019. The annual increase is larger than the previous year and beats the average over the last decade. World Meteorological Organization's head of atmospheric environment research said the magnitude of the increase in carbon dioxide levels over the past 4 years was comparable to changes seen during the shift from ice age to more temperate periods, but back then the transition happened over a much longer time frame.
So the CO2 which we have now in the atmosphere is accumulated since 1750. So it's every single bit which we put in the atmosphere since that time actually forms the current concentration. It's not what happened today or yesterday. It's the whole history of the human economic and human development which actually lead us to this global level of 400.
Global data is not yet available for 2020, but the trend of rising concentrations appears to be intact. Like other scientific bodies, the World Meteorological Organization said it expects annual global carbon emissions to fall this year due to COVID measures, and ventured a preliminary estimate of between 4.2 and 4.7%. Such a drop will not cause atmospheric carbon dioxide to go down, but will slow the rate of increase temporarily on a scale that falls within normal variations.
If you would like to reach carbon neutrality or this 1.5 degree target, then we should become carbon neutral by 2050. And as I said, good news is that we have now a growing amount of countries and groups of countries who have committed to that. So far, we have 50% of the global emissions which are coming from China, European Union, and Japan and South Korea.
Irrespective of what we do to curb emissions today, much of carbon dioxide already emitted decades ago remains in the atmosphere and contributes to global warming, climate scientists say.
What we find is both the low end of the range of warming is a lot less likely, but also the high end is also a little less likely. So we can be more confident in constraining the bottom end of the range than the top end. But we find really that there is some good news and some bad news, right? The bad news is that if you were hoping that warming just wouldn't end up being much of a problem, that you'd only get a degree or two of warming if we double our emission or double our concentrations in the atmosphere, then you should be disappointed because we found that's not very likely. But at the same time, we found that some truly catastrophic outcomes where we get like 5 degrees or more warming are also a lot less likely. And so we really found that, climate change is about as bad as we thought it was, that the long-term best estimate of the amount of warming you get in this sort of doubling of atmospheric CO2 is pretty close to accurate.
It also confirms that the world is on course for extreme sea level rise and other severe climate impact. These effects are expected from a rise beyond 2 degrees Celsius. Already, the average global temperature has warmed by about 1.2 degrees Celsius.
So there's a number of climate contrarians who've argued that we don't need to worry about climate change because the Earth is probably not very sensitive to CO2. And I think this is a very strong refutation of that point. We look at 3 independent lines of evidence from sort of physical models of the climate, from historical observations of how the climate has changed, and from periods in the distant past, like the last ice age, for example. And all three of those give consistent estimates. And all three of them are pretty strong in excluding the possibility that we might end up with only a little bit of warming if we double our CO2. Now, it's really important to emphasize that we don't have to double CO2. In fact, I hope we don't. If we do nothing today and continue to emit at today's levels, we will. But we can, as a society, decide to reduce our emissions. And we've been making some progress toward that end in recent years. And so, this just emphasizes even more strongly the need to reduce our emissions if we want to avoid dangerous levels of warming.
Climate scientist Andrew Dressler at Texas A&M University said he hoped the findings would spur stronger action to reduce greenhouse gases.
I think we're in a position now where we actually can rapidly ratchet down emissions if we choose to do so. That's really the question here. Do we choose to take action or not? And I think a lot will hinge on U.S. leadership and the results of this election.
Meanwhile, the World Meteorological Organization says global temperatures will continue to warm over the next 5 years and may even temporarily rise to more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That does not mean the world will be crossing the long-term warming threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which science has set as a ceiling for avoiding catastrophic climate change.
There's something like 20% probability that we would reach a year during the coming 5 years that where we would have only 1.5 degrees warmer climate than during the pre-industrial times. And it's very likely that we will see months where we reach this 1.5 degrees already. So there's 70% probability that we would reach that.
But it does show the warming trend continuing apace, underlining the enormous challenge the world faces in meeting the 2015 Paris Agreement's goal of curbing climate warming emissions enough to keep the rise in temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius.
So of course the warming of the planet continues, and so far we haven't been very successful in implementation of the Paris Agreement. The greenhouse gas concentrations, especially carbon dioxide concentration, still continues in the atmosphere, and that's the main reason for this warming. And if we would like to reach this low limit of Paris Agreement, we should really enhance the ambition level of emission controls. Especially we should reduce the use of fossil energy, oil, gas and coal during the coming 20 years to be successful in reaching this low limit of Paris Agreement. So we have seen more than double the global warming in the Arctic, and that's going to continue. Then these tropical zones will face lower temperature changes than the global average, and then we estimate that there will be also changes in precipitation patterns for the coming 5 years, and for example, South America and Australia and some parts of Africa would face more severe drought during the coming 5 years, and there's an estimation that in Western Europe we will see more often storms than we have seen in the past. So this COVID era is, of course, it's also an experiment from atmospheric perspective, and we estimate to see something like 4 to 7% drop of the carbon dioxide emissions this year because of the lockdowns. But since the lifetime of carbon dioxide is so long, it doesn't have an impact on the concentrations in the atmosphere. So there may be a little bit of slowdown of the emission growth, but it doesn't change the big picture.
Europe should see more storms, while North Atlantic will be windier. The projections are part of a new World Meteorological Organization's effort to provide shorter-range forecasts of temperature, rainfall and wind patterns to help nations keep tabs on how climate change may be disrupting weather patterns.
Climate Pact, agreed in Paris 5 years ago, compels countries to make efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, above which scientists warn of catastrophic climate change. While it is not the same as crossing the long-term warming threshold, the World Meteorological Organization says there is at least a 1 in 5 chances of temperatures temporarily on an annual basis exceeding that level by 2024. That's our program. Thank you for watching. Do join us next week for another episode of the program. From me, Ayola Kasim, and all of us here in Lagos, it's bye for now.